Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Facts on the Ground. I am Misty Winston and I am joined today by my co-host Jesse Zerwell. We have a really awesome return guest on today to talk about some stuff that nobody else I haven't seen a lot of people talking about. But before we do that, I just want to shout Rome out. I don't know if you guys can even see it, but I have his Kiss a Kami shirt on. So yeah, I just wanted to rep him today a little bit, and you guys can find shirts. I think he has a link on his Twitter page, but yeah. And then actually our guest today is Morgan Artyukhina, and she has a cool shirt on too. But they are an autistic, transgender and socialist activist, a writer, and is also a journalist with Sputnik News. And they've been on the guest before many times. We've talked about several different super awesome issues. But today we're going to be talking a little bit about what's going on in the West Sahara. So Morgan, thank you so much for coming back to the show. We appreciate you.
My pleasure. I appreciate you guys too.
Yeah, good to see you again, as always. So this is, as Misty alluded to, an issue that not many people are aware of, let alone covering in journalism that's being done today. So I know it's hard to condense history into bite-sized pieces, but perhaps we could start with a brief history of Western Sahara and how it came to be in the state it is today, which is essentially totally occupied.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess the key to understanding the modern borders, the kind of modern concept of a nation of Western Sahara is to go back to the 19th century and like the scramble for Africa. And those people not familiar, basically what happened was in 1884, a bunch of the major imperial powers got together in Europe. The European imperial powers got together and kind of decided where basically the rules of like how they were going to divide up large parts of Africa, and they eventually carved up 90% of Africa, with every country except for Liberia, which was a U.S. protectorate, and Ethiopia being colonized, and that included this little strip of the Sahara Desert that borders the Atlantic Ocean, which was grabbed by the Spanish, who were really kind of a minor player. This was the era that they were, they lost the Spanish-American War and lost basically all of their other colonies, Cuba and the Philippines and stuff. The rest of South America had already broken away, so they were really kind of like a minor player in this. And so they grabbed Spanish Sahara, which was really it was kind of two different territories, Zaguiya El Amra and Rio del Oro, which were some of the oldest kind of parts of Africa that were actually kind of in contact with whatever. The point is, what I'm trying to say is it became this Spanish colony, Spanish Sahara, and by 1975, which was a couple years after Francisco Franco died, and the kind of Francoist, fascistoid, Catholic authoritarian state that existed fell apart. One of the consequences of that was that the Spanish Sahara got independence, and when that happened, there was a bunch of things that kind of happened at once. The territory was supposed to be divided between the independent states of Morocco and Mauritania. That was kind of the agreement anyway, without really consulting the Sahrawi people, who are indigenous to Western Sahara. They're an Amazigan people, kind of live on the kind of semi-nomadic. I mean, I don't want to say that totally, but like that's kind of the tradition they come from of people who traditionally ran the trade routes across the Sahara Desert. So it was supposed to be the plan was that it would be split between Morocco and Mauritania. Well, the Sahrawis objected, and they had fought their own kind of anti-colonial wars against the Spanish and already had a coherent like national liberation movement. which coalesced into this group called the Polisario Front, the Frente Polisario, which declared a Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic just a couple of weeks after the Spanish handover of power.
What does that translate to in English?
Sahrawi?
No, El Frente Polisario.
Oh, Polisario is an acronym. It is the Popular Front for the Liberation of Sagia Alhambra and Rio del Oro. So,
cool. Just wanted to clarify that for
but it's just an acronym.
My own knowledge and for everybody who's watching.
Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. But yes, that was the name of the two colonies that together made up Spanish Sahara.
Yeah. And I think that like kind of leads us up to the situation we find ourselves in today, which is, well, first of all, it's the reason why nobody's talking about it. Maybe we should talk about this first, is the fact that, media is not even really allowed into the region at all, into West Sahara. I think Democracy Now! Got in a few years ago, but that's really been it. So, I mean, how have they been able to keep the media out? Why are they keeping the media out? And what does that say about our media, that's a thing that's happening right now?
Yeah, well, there's two parts to that. One is the fact that Morocco is a close U.S. partner. I think it's considered like an official, non-member partner of NATO and stuff like that. And the other half is the fact that Morocco, is very, very authoritarian. They are a monarchy. There is not a lot of guarantees for civil and political rights there too. So it's kind of two pronged.
King Mohammed VI is the ruler, right?
Yes, he is. But yeah, so the reason for this big lockdown is kind of what I was just getting to, which is the fact that like now you have these three sides to this war, or to this struggle, and so the Polisario fought both the Mauritanians and the Moroccans. They defeated the Mauritanians first, forced them to sign a peace treaty in just a couple of years. Mauritania gave up their claims to Western Sahara at that time, but the Moroccans never did, and the Moroccans organized this huge occupation march. Basically, I forget what they called it off the top of my head, but basically what they did was they had hundreds of thousands of settlers kind of march, into the country and really settle a lot of the coastal areas, which is where really all the major settlements are, is right on the coast for the most part. So that was kind of this attempt to kind of claim this territory, and then from 1979 or so until 1991, they fought this really brutal anti-colonial war in which more than 100,000 people died, and against between the Sahrawi army and the Moroccans. And that ended in 1991 with a peace deal that in which the United Nations agreed to supervise a independence referendum for the territory of Western Sahara. And I should say, in the process of doing that, the Moroccans, what they did was they built a series of sand walls through the desert that are they're almost 2,000 miles long. That is the longest wall on the planet, which literally cordons off all of the areas where there are natural resources and where there are big settlements from the vast desert, which is kind of where the Sahrawis are allowed to exercise any political power. So that's kind of the situation there. And that was, it kind of held this peace until a couple of months ago. And basically the Polisario and the Sahrawi people are kind of getting very impatient with the UN mission to Western Sahara for a couple of reasons. One is they've never held this independence referendum, and a big reason for that is obstructionism by Morocco.
Right.
And two,
and again, this referendum was first proposed in 1991, and
91.
Here we are in 2021, and nothing's been done.
No. And so it's been kind of neglected. A special Secretary General Special Envoy hasn't been appointed for several years because no one wants to take the position. As I said, Morocco runs obstructionism every time they try to organize the referendum and stuff. So it's a huge mess. And so this all kind of came together back in October and into November when a bunch of Sahrawi activists organized a demonstration at a new border crossing between Western Sahara and Mauritania at a town called Guerguerat. And they organized a kind of occupation, a peaceful, sit-down protest, shutting down this border crossing, saying, this is an illegal border crossing. It's used to, export, minerals and the wealth of our country that is being stolen from us. And, it was right around the time that the UN was supposed to renew its mission in Western Sahara. And so they were like, we want you to be, take greater action towards an independence referendum. We want you to assign a human rights monitoring, facet to the UN mission here, because it's the only UN mission that doesn't have one. So that was the kind of all these demands. And then the Moroccan army forcibly dispersed that protest in early November. And that was really kind of the end point. Polisario at that point said, like, you've broken the seas. Like, this is like not cool. And so that was when they took up arms again and are now the war is back on. And then a month later, in early December, is when Trump came out and acknowledged that the U.S. was going to recognize Morocco's claims of sovereignty over Western Sahara, and that was part of a larger deal in which Morocco would agree to normalize relations with Israel. So that was kind of the way that they traded that. And then now people both in Western Sahara and sympathetic people around the world are pressuring the UN to take action. They're pressuring the US government, pressuring Biden to reverse this. And what's really interesting is that it's not just kind of grassroots activists. Some of the highest levels of US diplomatic circles are so firmly against Trump's decision to do this. John Bolton, James Baker, Jim Inhofe have all written, op-eds in Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy and the Washington Post and whatever, condemning this as a betrayal of the Sahrawi people, betrayal of the U.S.'s, past 30 years of diplomacy.
John Bolton
really alienated us from a lot of people. What's that?
John Bolton actually wrote against the occupation?
Yeah, he wrote an op-ed in Foreign Policy, which is actually not terrible. I'm like, wow, this is actually a decent argument. It's it's like that Onion article where it's
weed that night.
He probably didn't write it.
Awful, person you despise just made a great point.
Right.
But yeah, no, it's on, and he and Baker, who was
Foreign Policy is weird like that.
They are.
Sometimes.
And I don't want to get started on foreign policy because I know right for foreign policy. But yeah, James Baker, who was George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, after he did that, he was actually the UN's Secretary General's special.
I think it's actually important that we talk about how influential the U.S. is in this situation, because Morocco, I think, didn't they surpass Egypt recently as the country buying the most weapons from the United States in the region? This is not something we don't have our greedy, sticky fingers, all entrenched in. I mean, as far back as Kissinger. I mean, Kissinger wanted the rigged UN vote, in the 70s or whatever. So yeah, I mean, can we talk a little bit about the U.S. influence and why this is important to us in a geopolitical kind of way?
Yeah, definitely. So the Morocco was used to house a major air base that U.S. bombers were allowed to use. And in the 50s and 60s, really before we had ICBMs and stuff, nuclear-armed bomber patrols on the edge of Soviet airspace were the way that the U.S. kind of was ready for nuclear war, at that time. And so those bombers would need places to land and refuel and whatever. And so that's why you also Incirlik Air Base in Turkey was another such place that was that kind of thing. So there's a big air base. I forget what it was called. It's just outside of Casablanca, where U.S. bombers and spy planes and stuff could kind of, top off before going across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah. And Saudi Arabia provided the U.S. that facility during the first Gulf War.
Yeah, they provided them a lot of facilities, use of like King Khalid military city and some of their air bases, especially for the air campaign.
Just as a side note, was one of the reasons bin Laden declared his jihad on the United States, or so he said, because the infidels were let into the land of Mecca and Medina. Paraphrasing, but it's pretty close to that. So just to make the point that there's historical precedence for this, and it's not just confined to North Africa.
Yeah, no, I mean the U.S. has done this all over. A lot of its partners, its established partner nations, and really partner nation basically means like you let us land our bombers there. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And we'll let our military come and train your military. We'll have joint training exercises and
exactly. We'll help you. We'll help this murderous kleptocracy stay in power. Honduras is another place. There's an enormous air base in Honduras that the U.S. is very interested in. Zelaya was threatening to nationalize, or even he wasn't going to nationalize them. Sorry, he was just going to turn it into a civilian, airport.
I think Max Blumenthal did a short video documentary about that air base. I forget what it's called, but it's huge.
It is, yeah, no, it's got like a 10,000-foot runway. It's capable of handling the largest U.S. transport aircraft, and it's a thing. It's a I've never seen that documentary of his, but I mean, I've talked. I know that he knows what I'm talking about. But it's like a logistics hub. It's like for the U.S. who needs to export its weapons to wherever it's whatever Contra movement it's supporting or whatever, or they're probably going to touch down there and be kind of run through there. So. This air base in Casablanca was a big part of that kind of thing. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The U.S. has a really kind of twisted way that it facilitates its arms exports. The Foreign Military Sales Program, what it does is the U.S. gives other countries money so that they can turn around and buy U.S. weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's just another form of subsidizing of the U.S.'s own military-industrial complex while facilitating the export of armaments, and the arming of, like you said, partner nations, which are really kind of U.S. garrison states all around the world.
Israel and Saudi Arabia being the two foremost examples,
yes,
I would say.
And Jordan and Israel, all get this shit too. But yeah, Morocco, I think in 2019 requested to buy more U.S. weapons than any other country did. And a big part of that is that they bought like Apache helicopters, they bought fighter jets, and it's like they don't need this stuff. Like I wrote an article back in I think 2018 when they bought the helicopters, and I was like, what are they going to use it for? They're going to use it to occupy Western Sahara. Like they haven't fought. Well, so that's not quite true. I was going to say that they haven't fought a war in years, but actually Morocco was a junior partner in the Saudi-led coalition in the war in Yemen. They sent a squadron of F-16s bought from the U.S. to go fight, meaning bomb Yemeni hospitals and other shit.
And buses.
And they were pulled out. They were pulled out a couple of years later. A couple of them got shot down, and it was kind of like unpopular. Plus, the war was becoming more unpopular by that point too. But yeah, no, they were part of that. Senegal was a part of that. Sudan was a part of that. Everybody talks about Saudi Arabia and UAE, but there was like 7 or 8 nations that joined that coalition in 2015 when it was like, oh shit, it looks like these Shiites might take over this country. Can't have that. So, they were a part of that too. And that's not something people really talk about. Is that they were a part of that genocidal conflict as well.
Yeah,
Morocco was.
I really don't think people recognize to the extent that we export death and destruction.
True.
on so many different levels. When we talk about, like you were saying, we give countries money so that they can buy our weapons. And then we also use those weapons to go and occupy countries. And our friends that buy our weapons occupy countries and, bomb people. And it's just so overwhelming when you start to think about to the degree that happens all around the globe. It's a lot.
And what's striking too is that based on what we've been talking about and your work that I've read, is that the similarities between Morocco and Israel are mind-boggling. The parity that's there. And
it's just the playbook. This is the playbook.
I mean, I agree.
I can't help but think that Morocco is America's North African version of Israel. And
absolutely. And South Africa was its Southern African version. It's the same dynamic.
Yep.
And what you point out in your piece, which we'll obviously link to in the show notes, is that among, let's say, normal Moroccan citizens, the sympathy for Palestinians and Palestinian self-determination is very strong, but the monarchy there obviously does not care about that sympathy and is more invested in maintaining its power. And I don't know what they want to turn the country into, but maybe you can speak about that a little bit, that through line from Morocco to Israel that is pretty obvious, I think, to anybody who starts to examine what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Moroccan monarchy has always been very politically close to the West. Morocco was kind of semi-colonized. It was kind of a client state of both Spain and France. I think it was considered a condominium in the same way that like Sudan was an Anglo-Egyptian condominium. But I don't know that that's necessarily the word they use. But the point is that the monarchy was a client of Western imperialism, and has kind of remained that way even after regaining formal independence. And as I talk about, in that article about how this deal that the U.S. organized between Morocco and Israel in December was not the first time that these nations had been talking. Actually, they've had backroom deals for decades, including helping. They fed, and now it's just not working, is it? I clicked away to the internet and it's like, I don't know, it decided to like reload the page.
Yeah. I love when that happens.
James Clapper.
Yeah. Our little NSA agent that, hi, whatever your name is. Yeah, but
but they helped the Israelis plan the devastating 6-day war. Gave them key intelligence about that, which resulted in the complete destruction of the Egyptian Air Force, and the seizure of the Sinai, the seizure of the West Bank, the seizure of Gaza and of the Golan Heights. So that was their work, and they also helped organize the first back channel that led to the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel in 1978. And there's a lot of other really kind of dark secrets too, which, like, for example, the Israeli engineers helped the Moroccans build the sand berm in Western Sahara, which you could think of as kind of an early articulation of the same, like the wall on the West Bank. Yeah. So it's the same concept. And I mean, Sahrawi were saying at the time, like a couple months ago, we're saying, this deal is that they're recognizing one occupation for another, just kind of recognizing each other's colonial land claims.
Right.
So it's definitely, Morocco's always been kind of happy to be that kind of like opportunism opportunistic thing. But you're right. There's a lot of grassroots support for the Palestinians, which has really been probably one of the biggest factors in stopping the Moroccans from the Moroccan monarchy from normalizing relations with Israel, openly. Has been it would be hugely unpopular. And the only reason that they were willing to do it now was because that's how powerful the U.S. is. We were saying, Misty, like the U.S. has this determinative, influence, that the U.S. was able to give them something really, really powerful, which was the endorsement of the world's sole superpower of their claims over to rule another country, and that was enough for them to convince them. They say it wasn't. They say the two have nothing to do with each other, but they're lying.
Right. Of course, they're lying. That's such a heap of bullshit. Anybody could see through that. I mean, I don't know if they could make it more obvious. But yeah, I think that this is something that, people need to learn to recognize, because like we said earlier, this is like, yes, this is what is happening in Israel too, but this is what we've done all over. Like, this has been replicated time and time again. And, this is to be expected. I mean, but I think the biggest thing that, like we talked about earlier, nobody's talking about Morocco. Nobody's talking about West Sahara or what's happening there. There's no media allowed in. And even if there were, it's not like at least Western media would cover it. I mean, they're not covering Yemen. They're not. So it's nobody is really paying much attention to the imperialism of the United States right now. So what do you think Biden's going to do? Because I don't I don't see him being any better than Trump on this, really. I mean, what's your impression?
If you had asked me a month ago, I would have probably said that I expected him to undo it. But I mean, we've had a month of lies and betrayal, most recently culminating in this airstrike in Syria. But I mean, we could count the things that that have been promised that haven't been or probably aren't going to happen. $15 an hour minimum wage, $2,000 checks, ending kids in cages, changing the immigration policy, it's looking right now like maybe the Equality Act's not going to get through the Senate. So like, I mean, what are we going to be left with at this point?
Right. I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh. It's just so what I predicted, and
we'll be left with like AOC's delusionally optimistic tweets.
Yes, that'll be fun. Too bad you feed your family with that.
But so that's my point is, like, I just don't know. Like, it seems like I said, like, there is such opposition to Trump's move at the highest levels. I feel like Biden will do it at some point. Just like there's a lot of pressure on there, but like I don't know. I just don't know. I don't really know how to predict it.
Right.
I hope he does.
To me, I feel like you predict it by what was the planned course of action long before Biden. And if that was for Morocco to take over West Sahara, then that's what's going to happen. It doesn't matter who's president. That's just what's going to happen. They may have to do like some different spin or some kind of PR kind of like fake left, juke right type situation where maybe he kind of backs off on it. But you know what I mean? Like how Obama did everything very kind of smooth and under the radar. And I don't think Joe Biden's going to be that kind of guy. They're going to have to they're going to hide him for the most part, I think. Bring him out for photo ops.
Joe Biden and smooth what I think belong in the same sentence.
Yeah.
You know what I think will probably happen? They will probably not walk it back because doing so means undoing, you know what I mean? Like it's kind of hard to unring a bell like that.
Yeah.
But the reason I think maybe it will be very heavily dependent on what happens with Iran. And the reason for this is that there have been claims going back to like 2018 or so by the Moroccan government that Iran or Hezbollah or somebody has been funneling support to Polisario via the Iranian embassy in Algeria. Because the Algerian government is very, very sympathetic to the Sahrawis.
Well,
And
that's
there's
where a lot of the refugees went,
There
is
are
it not? To
almost
Algeria? There are a lot of refugee
200,000
camps there.
Sahrawi refugees in
Right.
refugee camps across the border. They've gotten a lot of like obsolete Soviet equipment that the Algerians bought and gave to them, and the Algerians and the Moroccans don't get along very well either. They are in their own little arms race. The Algerians buy from the Russians, and the Moroccans buy from the Americans. So there's kind of an arms race going on there. Algeria and Morocco fought a war in 1963 or 64 over a patch of desert called the Sand War, and the resources there. So they don't get along at all. So there have been attempts to kind of like pin these connections on the Sahrawis or whatever. In the 70s, the CIA was saying that like the Soviets were funneling them support, and this movement of the Blue Men, as it was called at the time, these rebellious Imazighan groups in the desert all over the place, where it was kind of like that was the claim at the time of whatever, but they always say that kind of thing. So I think maybe it's probably tied to the U.S. whatever happens with Iran, if Biden decides to double down, and it looks looking like he may try to do that now, double down on this like Iran-backed militias, whatever. They may try to say that.
I'm still waiting for the names of those militias, by the way.
Well, the one that they said they hit the other day, was Kataib Hezbollah, which is really kind of the one that they run to. Like, I mean, that was the one that Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes was, the leader of. He was killed in the same airstrike that Soleimani was killed in. So that's kind of their go-to, like, oh, it's an Iran-backed militia, whatever. So I think it was Kataib.
I love the article, and they're like, it was an Iran-backed militia, but we don't know who actually did it. And I'm like,
the New York Times article is really revealing about, like, they don't know a goddamn thing.
No, and it's
the first
clear.
Politico piece that came out was only 2 paragraphs, and it was the most worthless, vague,
they are
geopolitical reporting I've ever come across.
Yeah.
And,
so I think that whatever direction the U.S. goes with, Iran is probably going to govern this as well.
What kind of influence do you think Israel will have? Because Trump obviously loved him some Bibi Netanyahu, and so the fact that Morocco could,
Biden does.
Well, kind of, but it's a little bit less of an obvious, like Barack Obama didn't have like a super publicly cozy relationship. Obviously, we are going to do whatever the fuck Israel wants, no matter who is in control.
But
but I think Barack Obama had like a cooler, what?
If you put it in context.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Barack Obama was more publicly kind of like standoffish with Bibi. Trump loved him. Like it was a whole big road.
Saying his standoffishness was nothing. It was performative and
yes, but that's what I'm saying. I'm putting it in context. Like now you're going to have a Biden administration. Is that going to make a difference? The fact that he may have that same kind of approach that Obama did, and have more of like a is he going to want to be that obviously pro-Israel, where he's going to if Morocco does recognize Israel, and is that going to be like a determining factor in how he chooses to handle it? Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't expect Biden to do anything to help Palestinians at all. I think he will pretty firmly
side
with
Morocco, Morocco and the West Sahara. Like, is Israel going to influence his decision there?
Well, I mean, that's kind of what the whole calculus of this is. Like, what are all the effects of the U.S. reversing its decision? Like, what happens with, vis-a-vis Morocco and Israel, too? I don't know. I don't have the answers to that question. But I think that's, and then like I said, also, with, what happens with Iran too, will influence that too. So I would even say the influence of politics in Algeria,
there's a lot of nuance to what's happening. And, like there's, like you said, Algeria, there's the Iran connection, there's the Israel connection. There's, just the fact that we have a new administration. There's like a lot of moving parts to like where this could go. and how this is going to turn out. Because I mean, like you said, that there was a ceasefire for, it was almost 30 years, right? It was like 29 years or something. The ceasefire was, and I mean, that was, when was that? That was like a couple weeks ago, right? That was broken a few weeks ago.
November, early November.
Okay. Oh, I thought it was not quite that far, or quite that long. Yeah. So I think this is something that's really kind of picking up steam. There's AFRICOM to consider. There's just a lot going on in this situation, and trying to like piece out all the different moving parts and influences is complicated.
And so
Well,
this is obviously a long-running colonial operation on the part of Morocco, and any part of a colonial operation involves a plundering of resources, and that's something you talk about in your piece. Under international law, it's actually called plunder, according to the Polisario representative you spoke to. So can you talk about what valuable natural resources Morocco has, and particularly in the Western Sahara?
Yeah. So
and also the foreign companies, or some of them, involved with plundering those resources.
Yeah. So Morocco's got, or Western Sahara has a couple of valuable resources. One is phosphates. It has some decent phosphate deposits. They are nothing compared to what Morocco has in its own territory. Morocco has so much phosphate that it has almost a global monopoly on chemical fertilizers and stuff, because it has so much. It could mine at its present rate and not run out for 300 years. Like,
Wow.
they have just ungodly amounts of phosphate. Western Sahara has some too. It's nothing compared to what Morocco has. Actually, bizarrely enough, Western Sahara's biggest export in terms of money is a rare type of octopus that lives off the coast. That is, it's endangered, and it's very, very valuable. But there's also lots of rich fisheries. This is close-ish to the equator. You're just kind of north of the equator a little bit. Lots of tropical warm water there. This is kind of the places. This is the part of the world where a lot of like the storms that become hurricanes when they get across to the Caribbean come from. So it's very, very rich waters off the coast. So those are the biggest factors. There are other smaller things, like there is a kind of microclimate along the coast at one point that is where it's actually really, really good for growing, because the water table is really high right there, and so they have like kind of a farming thing there, which is exports. Mostly they export, so it's so specific. They export tomatoes to the European Union.
Wow,
And
that is very
it's
specific.
a major export for them, because it's so cheap for them to do it there. Because they're in the biggest part of it is they're in the middle of the desert. They're surrounded by desert and on every side, so there are no natural pests. They don't need to treat any of the crops that they plant there.
Mm-hmm.
So they grow these tomatoes and stuff and export it, and it's just so cheap to do it. And also there's a paved road across the Sahara Desert. You can drive from Morocco to Mauritania on a paved road. Like that's a big deal too.
That's a
So there's a couple of reasons. There's also, of course, cheap labor. The capital city is Leon, which is north in the north of the country. Sits on a mostly kind of semi-dry riverbed, like a seasonal riverbed, and is right near this enormous phosphate mine, which is called Boukra, which is one of the world's largest phosphate mines. I mean, it's just, there's just really cheap labor there too. So there's a lot that they get out from it without that much effort on their part. So there's a kind of combined
So you mentioned the paved road. I know that recently there was a protest where that's what the Sahrawi people shut down that road. Is that kind of the way that they have been mostly fighting back as of right now, kind of leading the protests as far as shutting down the road? I know that there was some women-led groups that were protesting in the streets, and they were getting their asses kicked, which was disgusting. And I mean, literally getting their asses kicked, like their eyeballs are being popped out and noses are being broken, and they're being, it's a whole thing. So can you talk a little bit about like the protest climate and how they're trying to combat this occupation?
Yeah, well, as with most anti-colonial, anti-imperial movements around the world, women play a decisive role. Women are the organizers and the leaders and stuff. So there's nothing new there. But yeah, no, the Moroccan police are really harsh. There's two sides to the conflict. The one is the civil, protest movement and all of that stuff that's happening in the Moroccan cities and Western Saharan cities and stuff. And then the other is the armed struggle, which is the military, the Sahrawi military, which is attacking primarily concerned with attacking the sand berm. That's where most of Morocco's army is garrisoning this gigantic sand berm. So that's where the battles are happening.
And are these more face-to-face or on-the-ground battles, or do they involve more heavier artillery,
rockets, aircraft, and stuff? I don't know 100%. I mean, I did a couple of articles with like video and camera like photographs and stuff that the Sahrawi army I got from the Sahrawi army of combat there, but it's really just kind of artillery firing and missiles being launched and stuff. Rocket artillery. So yeah, it's kind of that kind of thing. But yeah, so the protest movement is. There's the Sahrawis, and then there's also a lot of Moroccan sympathy, especially among like university students and folks for the Sahrawi struggle. And so the Moroccan police, really worked hard to clamp down on protests in Moroccan cities as well as in Western Saharan cities. And as you said, they attack activists, they arrest people. There are several activists who have been on hunger strike for months in Moroccan jails, some of whom are now at risk of dying. They've been doing this for so long. So they go after. It doesn't matter if you're Sahrawi, if you're a Moroccan. What are you? If you are disturbing the peace and sympathizing, with the enemy in this war, then you're the same person to them. So so it's a really, really strong and strict crackdown across Moroccan society, everywhere the Moroccan government has control. That's where they do that.
And as far as, at least in, the 5 or so years following 9/11, and maybe it's still happening, I don't know, but correct me if I'm wrong, Morocco served as a torture by proxy country.
I don't know anything about that.
Okay.
I would be curious to know more about that.
Yeah,
I'm intrigued.
I hope I'm not wrong on that one. Well, actually, I hope I am wrong, because
right, that's
no torture. But I believe that's one of the lesser talked about former or
like a
current...
CIA black site, you're saying?
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's possible. I mean, it's a repressive, conservative client state who likes to work with the West, Well, I mean,
I'm talking in the context of people who are picked up and rendered to these sites.
Right.
Like Poland has a black site, for example. And that's what I mean by torture by proxy.
Yeah, maybe Syria had a facility too the U.S. used. So. Yeah.
I'm trying to hold on. Oh, good God. Anyway, go ahead. It's gonna take me a second to find it.
So.
Oh, you asked me about companies.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes,
are there
yes.
some heavy hitters, some big offenders? I'm sure there are, but
Oh
can you
yeah.
name some names?
So one of the biggest purchasers of these chemical fertilizers is Monsanto, which gets a tax break for it. They're the tax incentives by Morocco to invest and to buy from Western Sahara. So yes, those chemical fertilizers go to U.S. agribusiness, like Monsanto, for example. So that's supporting U.S. agribusiness, is what that is.
Yeah.
And
They're always involved, aren't they?
It's always that, right? There's one of those names that just pops up and it's like, yep. Like you didn't know, you could say, oh, it's Monsanto, and there's like a semi-good chance that you'd be right. But no, in this case, it is literally, it's Monsanto.
I feel like that's something I could use at dinner parties. Like if it's like a weird conversation you get into, you could, even if you don't know, you could probably be right. They're always involved.
So how would you characterize Polisario's economic viewpoint, if you will, or ideology, if you will? Are they capitalist? Are they socialist? Are they communist? Because in reading the statements by the representative you spoke to in your piece, she says that once everything is hopefully sorted out, so to speak, that Sahawaris will want to have businesses that are thriving and an economy that's flourishing. So it seems like that doesn't necessarily make it a capitalist group, but I'm just wondering if they have a vision for economic independence.
I mean, I think that they are like a lot of, third world liberation groups, national liberation groups, in that their goal is to escape dependency on the West, is to escape dependency on the colonial powers and the former colonial powers, and to really be able to march under their own 2 feet. And so the impression I've gotten is one very similar to like the FLN in Algeria, or Mali, or Burkina Faso, or Ghana, or any of these countries that broke free from Western imperialism and have undertaken programs of self-determination, of industrialization, of changing the way that things go to provide for themselves. And many nations have called that socialism, or incorporated significant elements of socialist movements or socialist ideas. Egypt did the same kind of thing for a long time. The kind of Arab socialist thing, and I think that in doing so, they are tapping into what really back when the Soviet Union was around, they called it the non-capitalist mode of development, which was a kind of a pathway that was opened up to modernization that was not dependent on kind of going through the capitalist stage or whatever. Whether you really believe that that's kind of stagist progression of history is accurate or not, it was this idea that a country would be able to industrialize without having to worry about certain things that other countries did have to worry about. And that was because of the strength of the socialist bloc that was able to trade with them and support them and give them aid and whatever. Soviet Union is gone, of course, the Eastern Bloc is gone, but there is still China, there is still Cuba. Cuba are supporters of Polisario. They're under their own, blockade, and their own,
Cuba
crisis.
I love Cuba.
They're not going to be building, power plants in a future, Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, in the way that maybe the Soviets might be. But, there are many options there. So I think that would be their primary concern, would be national development, and kind of whatever it takes to do that, to keep the wealth in the country, rather than being exported to Western firms and stuff, or Western companies. But I mean, it's always Like, I don't know that they are explicit like Marxist communists. You know what I mean? Like, we're going to get in power and kind of nationalize everything the way that I think a lot of like Western Marxists expect, a real socialist state to do or whatever. But like, every nation has their own path to socialism and national liberation. And I think that for a lot of the third world, national liberation and socialism are kind of two peas in the same pod. You know what I mean? Like, we're on the same road, we're on the same path. And that's why if you look at Algeria, for example, Algeria was not a socialist government, but it was very socialistic. You had a lot of government-directed industrialization and research and housing programs and, a lot of really, really powerful stuff. Social movements, you had a lot of socialists and communists in the government, but they didn't see them, they were not, kind of, beholden to a specifically, Marxist governing ideology, that governed their decisions. They were governed by the decisions of what does Algeria need to walk under its own 2 feet, So it's the same kind of.
I'm glad you bring that up, though, actually, because I think people like there's some textbook way that you get from A to B, and every country is different. Every country is under a different set of circumstances. Every country has its own current economic situation and their own current struggle with whatever they're, what I mean. So trying to think that, like you said, Marxists are like, if you do it, it has to go like this. And I think that you're right. I think a lot of countries, especially just coming out from, being under Western control for so long, you really just have to do whatever you have to do to figure it out. Because I think that that's probably, a huge learning curve that you have to go through just to even have the ability for self-determination and figuring out what works. So, yeah, I think that we have to be a little bit more fluid and how we think that should go, and across the globe or whatever, if we're looking at like a global socialist movement. So yeah, like that just really struck me when you said that sometimes people think that it has to go from A to B in a certain way. But yeah, I think that you're right too. Like, I'm not a huge fan of labels anyways, like socialist, communist, whatever. Like there are a lot of things that I agree with. There's some things from other ideologies that I'm like, yeah, okay. Like, I feel like people need to be a little bit more fluid in their thinking sometimes, and just be open to things outside the box. Like, it's okay to not stick to like a strict set of rules and to consider other options. And yeah, I don't know how I got on that rant. I'm all over the place.
I was just wondering if they, like the Black Panthers, for example, have a specific platform, specific economic platform, which it sounds like they don't, which again is up to them to decide. But speaking of Algeria, after 1991, when I guess you could say the first Sahrawi Intifada happened. Not long after that, the Algerian Civil War began, and which is another war that's long forgotten and horrendous. Babies were getting their throats cut. Robert Fisk is like one of the only reporters who's really delved into that. And I'm wondering if there's any connection between the end of the armed struggle by Sahrawis in Morocco and then the start of the Algerian Civil War so soon afterward.
I don't think so. I mean, the track of the rise of like the specific kind of like Salafist movement that was at the heart of the Islamic Salvation Front really has its roots really going all the way back to the 70s in Algeria. I mean, the FLN had as its officially stated goal the creation of like I don't remember the exact phrase they used, but it was basically kind of like a Muslim socialist, like a kind of they were officially trying to create a kind of Islamic state, a state that was inspired by and kind of dominated by a concept of Islam. And again, I mean, I think this is a very kind of decolonial, anti-colonial aspect, kind of concept, in the same way that we were talking about just a second ago in terms of like interpreting and applying Marxist principles or socialist, ones to this kind of process of self-determination. There was a specifically kind of Algerianness, I guess you could say, to the kind of Islamic socialism at the heart of like the FLN. And this Islamic Salvation Front and other kind of related groups that were part of the Civil War were really they kind of got their grounding in that same kind of concept, but in the idea that like, well, we can do it better, because the FLN was kind of balancing many forces. I would say really that the end of the war in Afghanistan, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, had more to do with causing the Algerian Civil War than did the end of the war in Western Sahara. Because just like in Chechnya, just like in Kosovo, just like in so many places where these, wars erupted, these Muslim fundamentalist kind of directed wars erupted in the 1990s. In many cases, those were driven by fighters whose militant ideology was forged fighting as mujahideen in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And that kind of merging of different, because the thing is that a lot of the Muslim trends, the philosophies that kind of come together to under the aegis of that mujahideen movement were ones that originated in anti-colonialism or in a kind of Islamic modernism is what they called it, an attempt by different Muslim societies in Egypt or Afghanistan or Persia or India or wherever to kind of like find a way to hold on to what made them in the face of Western imperialism and colonialism. So like, for example, in India, there was a specifically anti-colonial, philosophy coming out of like the Darul Uloom Deoband, and then you have thinkers like Artyukhina, for example, who were kind of thinking about like, how can we retain who we are and our values in the face of kind of accommodating ourselves to this world in which the Europeans, we don't have the choice of ignoring the Europeans, Morgan, anymore.
Oh, that's so interesting, because as you're talking about that, I like sitting here thinking, this really is about more than, just like land and, geopolitical, strategy or whatever. This is about culture. This is about, keeping yourself, like you said, being able to remain who we are as, like just being able to keep that identity after being under, Western colonialism. Like that's so adds like a whole other level, I think, to the importance of these situations. So yeah, sorry, that just like really struck me as you were talking about it. I'm like, yeah, I can imagine that being a really tough battle, trying to figure out how to fight Western imperialism and maintain your own kind of selves and your country and what your country is, what it stands for, what it, that's a lot. I mean, that's a lot.
I mean, it's a challenge that every, formerly colonized nation has to go through. In Cuba, they've had this fight, this tug of war between, kind of a more conservative vision tied more closely to the Catholic Church versus, a kind of more secular one or an atheist one or, whatever have you. You can see it in Venezuela, you can see it in South Africa, you can see it in China, everywhere there is this kind of multifaceted, and that's really the thing, kind of what we were talking about too in terms of like economics and whatever is like these nations are struggling. These people are struggling with so many different facets of what colonialism does to people, to when your language and your religion and your customs and your identity is repressed and, articulations of it are repressed. Think about like Algeria, for example. The Pieds Noirs were, the European settlers were the only ones who had political rights, and they were, a sharp minority. The Arab and Amazigh peoples, who were the majority in Algeria, didn't have those rights. and the Muslims were, went to inferior schools and lived in, slums, and, were exposed to kind of a lot of the, fascistic level police violence that, we see directed against Black people here in the United States. It was the same kind of concept in Algeria
at the time,
too.
it was like an update of what Belgium had done in the Congo.
I don't know that it was quite as enthusiastically murderous as the Belgians were in the Congo, but I mean, there's no other way to describe it. That's what they
No, that
were.
was
Like,
just
if you read
great
like King Leopold's Ghost, like they fucking loved what they were doing, and searched for ways to be cruel.
Yeah. That's Adam Hochschild's book, right?
Yes, it is. And I mean, Adam Hochschild is kind of a piece of shit, but
Right.
like that book is really good.
But
I'm saying don't read his stuff about like the
pieces of
Gulag
shit-
because it's just garbage.
That
but,
book is
like,
very much worth
sometimes
reading.
pieces of shit do good work though. That
right,
happens.
Broken
Or they
Clock
say good things, or they do good things, and that's okay. Like, doesn't mean you have to co-sign everything they do.
But no, King Leopold's Ghost is really good. And if you want another book, I mean, there are other books out there to read about what happened in the Congo. And it wasn't just the Belgian Congo. The French Congo, they were doing the same thing, but the French kind of just, it wasn't as well publicized, so they didn't kind of like, they kind of got away with it. But they were doing the same thing across the border. But anyway, the point is that in Algeria, just to continue using the example of Algeria, because it's I would say roughly analogous to Western Sahara, with the exception that like Moroccans are also Muslim, so there isn't really a Muslim, component to that. But in terms of like, there are many facets to somebody's identity, and so a post-colonial state, a state trying to rise up from colonialism, has to balance the needs of nationalism and reclaiming one's national identity, which could have reactionary aspects, could have chauvinistic aspects. To it, there's going to be a religious aspect, which in many cases is tied to national identity, and that national identity was kind of forged by the joint oppression of colonialism. And then you have the needs of economic, determination of, how are we going to relate to the rest of the world? How are we going to organize ourselves at home? And then trying to balance the needs of like, capital versus not exploiting our own people, and a lot of the forces that come to dominate the anti-colonial movements, the colonial liberation movements, are ones who are talking about the greater unity of those struggles, to women's struggles, to workers' struggles, to whatever. So there's it's always a dynamic and multifaceted, and that's why like we were saying, like, you really can't look at a movement with kind of a formulaic aspect and say, well, they did it here, so why couldn't they do it there, or whatever. You kind of have to understand each situation as a unique, allocation of forces, which isn't just determined by the forces in the country, it's determined by its relation to other countries too. Like, that's one of the things to understand about China, because China is, officially a socialist state, officially Marxist-Leninist, the Communist Party of China rules and everything, but it's always such a rich, volume of opinions about, is it capitalist, is it fascist, is it imperialist, is it socialist, is it like market socialist, like how do you understand that? And I think that a lot of those discussions really kind of, they look at Deng Xiaoping, or they look at Mao, or Zhao Ziyang, or any of these other kind of different right forces acting in China at different times, and kind of try to say like, well, this should have happened, that shouldn't have happened, whatever, and fail to understand like kind of the greater dynamics of like what was happening in the rest of the world at that time, and how that affects the dynamics of the struggle inside of a country. So like just to take China, just a very brief example, if you look at the Chinese flag, there are 4 stars on the 4 little stars on the Chinese flag, and those represent the 4 allied classes: the proletariat, the peasantry, the urban petty bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie. And those are kind of 4 classes in alliance. It isn't just the working class, and peasantry. So there's been this kind of need to balance a diverse set of interests in going back and forth, and what's really possible at the time. So there's a lot of forces, and that's influenced by its relationship with the Soviet Union, its relationship with the United States, its the existence of a wider socialist bloc. It's influenced by by any number of other things, around the return of Japan as an economic power in the region. So much goes into playing all of that. So it's like you really have to understand each situation in its uniqueness. So long story short, to circle back around, as our favorite press secretary says, that is why I don't have an answer for you about what is the economic program of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic.
Is there another way you can circle besides going around?
Well, you could spiral down the drain, which is where the Biden.
Does she say circle back around? Because I thought, isn't it just we're going to circle back to that, or does she say circle back around? I'm sure she said both. Whatever. She's funny. She makes me laugh.
She is somebody who kind of talks first and thinks later, I think.
Yeah.
Which I empathize with to a
yeah, I do too. I think that's why, I don't like her, but I find her amusing.
And that's fine. That's not a judgment on her, but it's just like, why would you put somebody in that position who is going to be the gaffe master? Like,
well, when she said that it wasn't like that's not that's not how we do things or something the other day. Well, how did she phrase it? I don't even remember. But the guy was like, really that long-standing policy. It's been a long-standing policy in the United States that we don't. And the dude's like, since when? And I'm like, oh, it's so good.
Right.
Like,
about
democracy, journalists actually push
democratic
back.
Transitions. Yeah, I remember that.
Was that Matt Lee from AP? He's a really
It was about Venezuela, right?
What's that?
It was about Venezuela,
right? I think it was about coups. Yeah, I think they were talking about Venezuela, and they were talking about overthrowing governments or coups or something to that subject matter.
Like, it's a long-standing policy. We support democratic transitions, and they're like, where?
And he's like, since when? And I'm like, oh, because journalists in that room usually are awful. And so when one of them actually pushes back or does something great or ask a great question, I get really excited about it. It makes me happy.
Well, that's why they took away our White House press pass. They took away Sputnik and RT's press passes for the White House and the Capitol. Mm-hmm. Because we asked. That's the thing. Psaki mocked, the fact. Well, I don't know where they are, why they're not here, but I like to have fun. It's like, we're not there because you took it away. Yeah. You took away our press pass.
Did Biden do that, or was that a Trump thing?
No, that was a Trump thing. That was a FISA. Shortly after the FISA thing, they just took it away, and they didn't fucking explain themselves. So
was that about the same time they started labeling Lee Camp as Russia state-sponsored media or something?
No, it was right around the time that Andrew Feinberg decided to turncoat.
Oh, okay.
Because he was the Sputnik White House correspondent.
So will RT and Sputnik, can they reapply or however that works? Or no?
I don't know. I'm not on that.
You're registered.
I'm just curious if they will.
They should. Both are registered in D.C. at some institution as Russian affiliated, at least. Yeah. But my favorite is if you watch Telesur and it says this channel is
South America,
or maybe affiliated with
the Latin American government.
The Latin American government.
Yeah.
Which one?
Which one, dudes? Can you be more specific? Can you give us
Africa as a country, Latin America as a country,
right?
Yeah. Who's the president of the African government?
We'll say Mandela. Yeah. Nelson Mandela.
But I'm not surprised. I don't think that's a gaffe. I think that's just colonial stupidity that.
Yes. Well, and they don't want to necessarily label it because then then they can't include all of them in it, which is what they're trying to do. They want to include all of them. So they just leave it very vague so that it's a big tent, Jesse. It's a big tent. It's a big tent label.
I'm not a fan of tents.
Yeah, me neither.
So, Morgan, I wanted to ask you too, if you could talk more about the international law aspect of what's happening in Western Sahara and how important the UN's role is or is not in sort of determining.
Good. And then we can probably wrap too here pretty soon. You've been very generous with your time again. I know we always go super long. So, but yeah, I think this is definitely something we should get into a little bit. The UN's role and what are the options here, and
because the UN's been primarily on the side of, well, useless, but ostensibly on the side of the people of Western Sahara. So I'm wondering what the current status is, and if you think that there is actually any hope for international law playing a part in resolving this.
Well, the U.S. is very isolated in its position. When it happened, the UK and Russia and a couple other countries explicitly came out and said, this is a violation of international law. Like, what you're doing is against the law. We don't support you. We don't support this. You know, this has been long-standing policy to support what the United Nations agreed upon in 1991, which was to facilitate this independence referendum. Now, kind of like what I was saying earlier, you know, there has been a lot of obstructionism by Morocco and, you know, by some other countries that are kind of, you know, Morocco manages to kind of pull some strings or whatever, you know, one way or the other. You know, the as I said, like the special envoy for the Secretary General has been kind of an absentee position for about 2 or 3 years now. I mean, they did renew MINURSO, the UN mission to Western Sahara, in October. They did vote to do that. They did not add a human rights component. You know, Amnesty International has been very firmly against, you know, against the crackdown against Sahrawi and Moroccan, you know, activists, peace activists. They have, you know, called for the same thing, you know, the adding of a human rights component to the UN mission and all of that, and really, you know, the fight fought for the rights of people in Moroccan prisons and stuff. So the U.S.'s position is very, very, very unpopular, even among a lot of people who are happy to do the U.S.'s bidding. You know, Amnesty International, like I said, and even within U.S. political circles, John Bolton, yeah, the UK usually toes with us, and they are very, very firmly against what the U.S. has done. And then, like I said, like John Bolton and James Baker, you know, Jim Inhofe, you know, are all very vocally, and more are all very vocally against this. And actually, my most recent story about this was about a joint letter that was signed by Inhofe and Patrick Leahy. So it's a bipartisan thing calling on Biden to you know, unring that bell. So it's very, very unpopular, and that's one of the reasons, like, that when I look at it, I have to say, like, maybe Biden will be more, you know, amenable to bowing to that pressure than Trump will. Like, Trump was happy to say, fuck you, we'll go alone, you know, but, like, the Democrats, generally speaking, are all about, like, you know, working, we have to build a diverse coalition, we have to, you know, reach across the aisle, like they believe in that shit. Like, so they care to a certain degree about international opinion, like Republicans and Trump especially don't. I want to believe that it will affect influence.
I have very little hope. Sorry.
I have little hope too, but like
I don't have any hope.
I would.
And they don't care that the UN is mad or that Amnesty is mad, or, I mean, look at what they're doing to Julian Assange. They do not care. They're breaking like every international law known to man. And
nobody's going to risk anything over Western Sahara. They're just going to kind of, like, you know, frumple their brow and just kind of, you know, send a politely worded letter.
Yes, a strongly worded letter and maybe a snarky tweet, and that'll be the end of it. yeah, I think that's, what troubles me, and I'm mad at myself for not expecting it more, is that even the progressives in Congress and stuff don't speak out about this. The progressives, they're all very imperialist. They're all very coup friendly and, just kind of run of the mill foreign policy turds. And it's depressing.
Yeah,
And it makes me sad.
And it emphasizes what I think we should re-emphasize is that this is a colonial war that's happening. These people are, the Saharis are occupied by a foreign aggressive military power, just like the Palestinians are by the Israelis. And the fact that there are still colonial wars happening, and they're happening largely because the U.S. is willing to green light them or supply them or what have you. I think that idea, just morally and philosophically, let alone materially, should bother people. And that's a huge reason to care about this story, even though it's gotten hardly any coverage because, as we stated earlier, one of the reasons is that journalists essentially are not let into this occupation zone called Western Sahara. So the fact that people are still living under those conditions in the world, not by their choice, but at gunpoint, should really anger people.
States backing all of that stuff, and then the progressives in the United States go along with it. And and foreign policy is like domestic policy. Jesse and I say this all the time. If you ignore our foreign policy, you're not doing your due diligence, because all of this shit manifests itself back at home. You can't be the world's largest terrorist organization and think that you're going to get to skate by, with no consequences whatsoever. That's not how that works.
And that's why the importance of, companies like Monsanto, being enmeshed in that, which, by the way, there was another thing that I didn't mention because it hasn't really been explored that much, but they think that there are probably going to be offshore oil deposits off the coast.
Uh-huh.
And those would be much more substantial than the phosphate deposits. There hasn't been a lot of exploration for that, but that is another thing out there to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. But yeah, talk about Monsanto. Monsanto is a great example of the bridge. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They get cheap chemical fertilizer from Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara. They then use that to put small farmers in the United States out of business.
Yes.
They use that.
Those are connections that need
further
to be
their
made.
Business model. The U.S. government gives Monsanto $1 billion in its fucking farm bill to subsidize this, which then they turn around and they use free trade agreements to dump under market priced crops on markets in other parts of the third world, put those farmers out of business, and now they're dependent on U.S. food exports too. So there is, it's a cycle. Domestic, foreign, it all affects, you want to talk about farmers being put out of business in the Great Plains. You want to talk about farmers pouring their milk down the drain in Vermont. It's all because they have to compete with this mega industry that is being fueled by this imperialist largesse that they're getting from the U.S. government.
And thank you for saying it, because those are connections that need to be made more often, because I don't think a lot of people are putting those things together. There are a lot of people in the United States that do not pay at all attention to foreign policy or how it affects them. They don't care. They don't want to talk about it. They're not angry every time that there's some defense spending bill that is approved with no conversation whatsoever, no debate whatsoever. Nobody talks about it. Nobody's angry about it. That is being used against you too. Just because it isn't a domestic policy thing like healthcare or education, that absolutely does influence your life on a daily basis. And I really wish we could get people to pay more attention to foreign policy. That's why I'm glad that we do these shows. That's why I'm super grateful to you for your coverage of this, because not a lot of people are talking about it. So finding journalists that are covering these things is really difficult to do. So we need to share those people, share their work, make sure it's getting out there. Because we really have to start making these connections more, I think, for people to understand the big picture of what's going on. I mean,
Yeah, a couple
that's
of
just how I
accounts
see it.
to
That's why I
follow.
say like being anti-imperialist is it's not negotiable for me. I'm not willing to negotiate. Like if you're people get mad because I don't like progressives or whatever. No, I am not going to support a politician who says we're going to defer to caucus leadership on an obvious coup in a foreign country. I'm just not. I'm not. That's a red line for me. I won't do it. So yeah, I think that if we make those connections more, maybe people will start seeing how those things really are. They go hand in hand. It's intermeshed. You cannot separate them really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, a couple other accounts for people if they want to follow. There's a collective of Sahrawi journalists called Sahrawi Voice. They're pretty good, and you can kind of see who there are other journalists and people who are on the ground there who you can follow that they share their stuff. Dan Cohen just put out a video which is really good on it, and he's been someone who's covered this too. His wife Elena Villar, who's a reporter for RT Espanol, has done several documentaries on this.
And Democracy Now, of course, did their documentary a few years ago when they actually did get through the media blockade, and they were able to report for the first time in a very long time from kind of behind the scenes of what's going on. So I know that they got to film.
They're one of the people who are reporting on it now too, in terms of the abuse of
which I have my issues with Democracy Now, but yes, they have been kind of one of the very few talking about this at all. So
credit where credit's due.
Yeah, for sure.
A lot of the material on Western Sahara is going to be in Spanish or Arabic, but a lot of it is in English too. It's a big issue for the Spanish left too. Is solidarity with that struggle because of that legacy of this was a former colonial state of them and whatever. So if you speak Spanish, then that can be a place that you can look for those things as well. But yeah, there's
we'll link to all of those things. We'll link to your articles. We'll link to. I think you have the two Twitter accounts linked in your tweet for the article, I think, if I remember correctly. So yeah, we'll definitely link to all that stuff so people can find it. And then why don't you let everybody know where they can find you, find your work, things like that. I know obviously everybody knows Twitter, blah, blah, blah. But just, let everybody know so that people can find your, and Morgan does great work, not just on this, like she's just, all of her stuff she's doing great work on Space Force, which I still find just endlessly fascinating. I don't know what it is about Space Force, but it's like equal parts cool and terrifying. I think that's why I'm into it. So
I agree.
Yeah, so just tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at @LavenderNRed, the letter N, Lavender N Red, like the colors. And you can find my work on Sputnik News. I write for Mint Press News occasionally. I write pretty regularly for Liberation News as well. Find me in the whirlwind.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. And I think this is a story that we'd like to follow up on as it develops, because it's obviously still developing. And, as we discussed before, it is quite important to us and other people, other Americans, because of its implications, its foreign policy implications, and all the other dynamics we discussed. So it would be great to have you back on to
definitely always shoot me a message,
keep tabs on this.
Yeah, definitely have to keep our eyes on this for sure.
All right, thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Yep.
Hi.